August 14, 1868. Market day in Tralee, County Kerry, Ireland. The screaming started at 9:30 in the morning. Witnesses would later describe the sound, not human screams but something far worse. The grinding of chain against cobblestone, the wet, rhythmic thud of something being dragged, and beneath it all the guttural huffing of an animal that had tasted blood. Margaret O'Sullivan, selling butter at her market stall, looked up to see the brown bear shuffling through Market Square. Behind it, still attached by a 12-foot chain wrapped around the animal's iron collar, was what remained of Dmitri Volkov. The Russian circus trainer's body carved a crimson trail across the stones his grandfather had helped lay 40 years prior. The bear stopped in the center of the square, sat back on its haunches, and began to eat. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple animal attack, because Dmitri Volkov had been dead for at least 6 hours before the bear dragged him into town, and the chains that bound them together had been locked from the inside of the cage, by human hands. Before we uncover the truth about the Tralee traveling circus and the beast that terrorized an entire county, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Also, we love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and whether traveling circuses ever came through your town. Now, let's step back to understand how such horror could unfold on an ordinary market day in Victorian Ireland. Ireland in 1868 existed in a state of uneasy transformation. The Great Famine, though 2 decades past, had left scars across the countryside that would never fully heal. County Kerry had lost nearly 40% of its population to starvation and emigration. The survivors carried memories of watching their neighbors die in ditches, of mass graves that even now nobody spoke about in polite company. Into this wounded landscape came the wanderers, the entertainers who promised escape from grinding poverty and traumatic memory. Tralee, the county seat, had once been a prosperous market town. Its Georgian buildings still stood proud along Castle Street, but many windows remained dark, their former inhabitants now in Boston or New York. The weekly market had shrunk from a regional gathering to a local affair, where the same faces sold the same goods to the same customers, week after week. The arrival of Konstantin Petrov's traveling circus of wonders in early August 1868 represented the most exciting thing to happen in Tralee in years. Petrov himself cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard and eyes that seemed to assess the worth of everything they fell upon. He spoke English with a heavy Russian accent, though some locals swore they detected hints of something else underneath, Polish perhaps or Czech. He had 3 wagons, painted in fading red and gold, 7 performers, 2 acrobats, a fire-eater, a strongman, a fortune-teller, and his star attraction, Dmitri Volkov, and his performing bear, Masha. The bear was enormous. Standing on her hind legs, Masha towered over 8 feet tall. Her brown fur showed patches of gray around the muzzle, suggesting an animal past her prime. But she could still dance, still bow on command, still open her massive jaws to accept sugar cubes from Dmitri's bare hand, while children shrieked with delighted terror. Dmitri Volkov was Petrov's nephew, or so the story went. 26 years old, slight of build, with delicate features that seemed almost feminine. He rarely spoke to the townspeople. When he did, his English proved better than his uncle's, carrying only a trace of Russian inflection. The circus set up camp in the field behind St. John's Church, with permission from Father Michael Brennan. The priest had initially hesitated, traveling shows off day. Ben brought trouble, but the promised donation to the parish poor box proved persuasive. Times were hard. The church needed money as desperately as everyone else. For the first week, all seemed well. The performances drew decent crowds, not the hundreds that might have attended before the famine, but enough to make the venture profitable. Children dragged their parents to see Masha dance. Young men competed to lift the strong man's weights. Women giggled over the fortune-teller's predictions of tall, dark strangers. But some things seemed slightly wrong if you paid attention. The way Dmitri flinched whenever his uncle approached. The bruises on the young man's wrists, visible when his sleeves rode up during performances. The fact that Masha's cage, a massive iron construction that required 4 men to move, was always positioned between Dmitri's sleeping wagon and the road leading out of town. Margaret O'Sullivan, who lived closest to the circus grounds, later testified that she heard weeping some nights. A man's voice crying in what sounded like Russian, followed by harsh words in the same language. Then silence. The local constable, Thomas Fitzgerald, had walked past the circus grounds several times during that first week. He noticed that Dmitri slept in his wagon with the door barred from the outside. When he inquired about this unusual arrangement, Petrov explained that his nephew had a history of sleepwalking. For his own safety, they secured him at night. It seemed a reasonable explanation. Constable Fitzgerald moved on. The first incident occurred on August 7th, 6 days after the circus arrived. Mary Doherty, age 9, approached Masha's cage during the afternoon when the circus grounds stood mostly empty. The performers were in town purchasing supplies. The bear lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight, her massive sides rising and falling with each breath. What happened next depended on whose account you believed. Mary claimed she only wanted to see the bear up close. She didn't touch the cage, didn't make any sudden movements. She simply stood there, marveling at the size of Masha's paws when the bear lunged. The cage bars held, but Masha's claws extended through the gaps, raking across Mary's shoulder and tearing her dress. The child's screams brought several adults running, including Dmitri Volkov, who had remained behind while the others went to town. What witnesses observed would later seem significant. Dmitri didn't rush to comfort the injured child. He didn't check her wounds or call for help. Instead, he approached the cage and stood perfectly still, staring at Masha. The bear stared back. For 30 seconds, neither moved. Then Dmitri spoke a single word in Russian. Masha retreated to the back of the cage and sat down, suddenly docile. Only then did Dmitri turn to Mary. His face, according to her mother who arrived moments later, showed no concern, no relief that the child hadn't been killed. His expression appeared completely blank. "You should not have come here," he said. "Not I'm sorry, not are you hurt, just that flat statement of fact." Konstantin Petrov arrived within the hour, effusive with apologies. He paid the Doherty family £5, an enormous sum, for Mary's torn dress and the surgeon's fee to stitch her shoulder. He promised that additional precautions would be taken. The cage would be roped off, warning signs posted. The incident faded from immediate concern, though Mary Doherty would carry the scars for the rest of her life. The second incident came 3 days later, on August 10th. Patrick Brennan, nephew to Father Michael and apprentice to the town blacksmith, was commissioned to repair one of the circus wagon wheels. The work required him to spend several hours at the circus grounds, hammering the iron rim back into place while the performers rehearsed nearby. Around midday, he heard shouting. Konstantin Petrov and Dmitri Volkov stood near Masha's cage, arguing in rapid Russian. Patrick spoke no Russian, but he understood anger in any language. The older man grabbed Dmitri's arm. The younger man tried to pull away. Petrov struck him across the face, hard enough that Dmitri staggered. Then Petrov said something that made Dmitri go completely still. The young man's face drained of color. He looked toward Masha's cage, then back at his uncle. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet Patrick could barely hear it, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, begging. Petrov laughed, pushed Dmitri toward the bear's cage, said something else in Russian. Dmitri opened the cage door and went inside. Patrick Brennan stopped hammering, held his breath, watched through the wagon, spoke as Dmitri stood in the cage with 800 pounds of bear. Masha rose on her hind legs, towered over the young man, extended one massive paw and placed it on Dmitri's chest, gently, almost tenderly. Dmitri didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. They stood like that for perhaps a minute. Then Masha dropped back to all fours. Dmitri exited the cage, locked it behind him. Konstantin Petrov was nowhere to be seen. When Patrick mentioned what he'd witnessed to his uncle that evening, Father Brennan frowned. "Circus folk have their own ways," he said. "Best not to interfere," but the priest made a point of visiting the circus grounds the next day, ostensibly to check on the promised donation. He found Dmitri practicing Masha's routines. The young man's face bore a fresh bruise along his left cheekbone. The third incident was reported by Constable Fitzgerald himself. On the night of August 12th, he was making his rounds when he heard sounds from the circus grounds. Not the weeping Margaret O'Sullivan had described, but worse, screaming, desperate, terrified screaming in Russian interrupted by harsh laughter. Fitzgerald hurried to investigate. As he approached, the screaming stopped abruptly. He found Konstantin Petrov and 2 of the acrobats drinking around a campfire. All 3 appeared slightly drunk but otherwise unremarkable. When Fitzgerald asked about the screaming, Petrov explained they'd been telling ghost stories. The acrobats nodded agreement. Very scary stories, they said. Made everyone scream. But Fitzgerald had been a soldier before becoming a constable. He knew the difference between playful fear and genuine terror. The sound he'd heard was the latter. He asked to see Dmitri Volkov. Petrov hesitated, then called out in Russian. No response. He called again, louder. Finally, Dmitri emerged from his wagon, moving stiffly. Even in the firelight, Fitzgerald could see fresh marks on the young man's neck. Bruises in the distinctive pattern of fingers. "Are you well?" Fitzgerald asked. Dmitri stared at him. For a moment the constable thought he might speak, might say something true, but then Dmitri's eyes flickered toward his uncle and back. "I am well," he said. "Thank you for your concern." Fitzgerald wanted to press further, the bruises, the scream, the way Dmitri held himself like a man in pain, but he had no grounds for interference, no law against a man bearing bruises, especially in the rough world of traveling circus folk. He left, but the incident troubled him deeply. He mentioned it to Father Brennan the following morning. The priest had heard confessions from several townspeople about their concerns regarding the circus. Nothing specific, just a feeling that something wasn't right. "Perhaps we should ask them to move on," Father Brennan suggested. "They've been here nearly 2 weeks. That's longer than most traveling shows stay." But before they could act on this impulse, August 14th arrived, market day, the day everything changed. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button to help us share these forgotten chapters of history with more people. And make sure to share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and true historical horror. The truth of what happened next shocked an entire nation. Let's discover it. Together. August 14th, 1868 began like any other market day in Tralee. Farmers brought their goods into town before dawn. Merchants set up their stalls in Market Square. The morning promised fair weather, crucial for a successful market, as rain would keep customers at home. Margaret O'Sullivan arrived at her usual spot at 6:30, arranging her butter and cheese for display. She noticed the circus wagons were still in their field behind St. John's Church. Usually Petrov's troupe would have at least one performer in town by now, drumming up interest in the evening show. This morning, the circus grounds stood silent. She thought little of it. Perhaps they were sleeping late. Perhaps they planned to move on soon and were packing their equipment. By 9 o'clock, Market Square bustled with activity. Perhaps 200 people browsed the stalls, conducting business, exchanging gossip. Children darted between adults, dogs roamed looking for scraps. Then someone screamed. Every head turned toward Castle Street, where it intersected with Market Square. A woman stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing. Coming down Castle Street, moving with a shuffling, swaying gait, was Masha the bear. Even from a distance, people could see the chain trailing behind her, could see something dark being dragged across the cobblestones. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret O'Sullivan whispered. "That's a body." Panic erupted. People scattered. Some ran for the nearest buildings. Others grabbed children and pulled them close. A few brave souls, including Constable Fitzgerald, moved toward the approaching bear, though none dared get too close. Masha seemed unconcerned by the chaos. She padded into the center of Market Square, her massive paws leaving bloody prints on the stones. The chain stretched taut behind her, the iron links scraping against cobblestones with a sound like grinding teeth. At the end of that chain was Dmitri Volkov, or what remained of him. The young man lay face down, his body twisted at angles that suggested every major bone had been broken. His clothes hung in tatters. His skin showed massive contusions, the kind produced by tremendous blunt force. The back of his skull appeared partially caved in, but what made several witnesses vomit was the blood trail. It stretched back up Castle Street, disappearing around the corner toward the circus grounds. Dmitri had been dragged through dirt, across gravel, over cobblestones, for at least a quarter mile. Masha reached the center of the square and stopped, sat back on her haunches, looked around at the frozen crowd with what Margaret O'Sullivan would later swear was satisfaction. Then the bear leaned forward and began to feed. Constable Fitzgerald, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol and fired twice. Both shots struck Masha in the chest. The bear roared, a sound that would echo in witnesses' nightmares for years, but didn't fall. She turned toward Fitzgerald, blood spreading across her brown fur. Father Brennan appeared, running from the church with his hunting rifle. 2 other men joined him, also armed. They formed a line and fired together. 4 more shots. 5, 6. Masha finally collapsed, her massive body hitting the cobblestones with a sound like thunder. Her eyes remained open, staring at nothing. Blood pooled beneath her. Nobody moved toward the body, either Dmitri's or the bear's. They stood in a horrified circle, staring at the carnage that had erupted into their ordinary morning. Then someone noticed the chain. The 12-foot length connecting bear to trainer ended at Masha's iron collar. But it also connected to a smaller chain around what remained of Dmitri's right wrist. Both ends were secured with padlocks. "Why would he chain himself to the bear?" someone asked. Constable Fitzgerald, his hands shaking from adrenaline, approached carefully. He examined the collar around Masha's neck, the chain, the manacle around Dmitri's wrist. Both locks re-engaged. Both required keys to open. "He didn't chain himself," Fitzgerald said quietly. "Someone else did this." The investigation began within the hour. Father Brennan led a group of men to the circus grounds. What they found there would haunt Tralee for generations. The circus camp appeared abandoned in haste. The fire pit still smoldered, food sat half-eaten on tin plates, clothing lay scattered. But all 3 wagons remained, and so did Masha's cage. The cage door stood open. Inside, the floor was slick with blood. Not fresh blood, this had dried to a dark, sticky residue that suggested it had been there for hours. Next to the cage, they found Dmitri's sleeping wagon. The outside lock had been removed. The door hung open. Inside, the scene told a story. Dmitri's bedding lay tangled and torn. The wooden walls showed deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at them desperately. A lamp had been knocked over, its oil staining the floor, and on the small writing desk in the corner they found a letter, written in English, in a careful, educated hand. Unfinished. "To whoever finds this, I fear I have little time. My uncle has sold me to the bear. He says it is my fate. He says my father promised me when I was born. I do not understand. I know only that tonight he will lock me in the cage with Masha. He has done this before, but never overnight, never with the cage left open to the outside. He says if I survive until morning, I will be free. But I will not survive. Masha is hungry. She has not been fed in 3 days. My uncle laughs when I beg him. He says..." The letter ended there. Whatever Dmitri had intended to write next would remain forever unknown. They found Konstantin Petrov's wagon next. Inside, they discovered something that changed the entire investigation. Books, dozens of them. Some in Russian, others in German and French. Books about ancient Slavic religions, about bear cults, about ritual sacrifice, about the worship of forest gods that predated Christianity by thousands of years. And journals, 3 of them, written in Russian, detailing what appeared to be Petrov's true purpose. The investigation into Dmitri Volkov's death became one of the most complex criminal inquiries in Irish history. The immediate problem was jurisdiction. The crime had occurred on Irish soil but involved Russian nationals. The British authorities in Dublin took control, dispatching Inspector Harold Weatherby from the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Weatherby arrived in Tralee on August 16th. A meticulous man with 15 years of investigative experience, he approached the case with the clinical detachment required for such horrific circumstances. His first action was to secure the circus grounds as a crime scene. His second was to order Dmitri Volkov's body examined by Dr. Edmund Hayes, the county surgeon. Dr. Hayes's report, preserved in the National Archives, made for grim reading. The deceased had sustained multiple fractures, both arms, both legs, ribs, pelvis, and skull. The pattern suggested systematic trauma rather than a single violent event. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning of August 14th, at least 6 hours before the bear dragged him into Market Square. But the most disturbing finding came from the internal examination. Dr. Hayes discovered evidence of previous partially healed fractures, broken bones that had mended without proper medical attention. Dmitri Volkov had been subjected to serious physical abuse for months, possibly years. The examination also revealed near starvation. The young man's stomach contained only water and what appeared to be bread. His body showed signs of chronic malnourishment. This man, Dr. Hayes wrote in his report, lived in a state of continuous suffering. Meanwhile, Inspector Weatherby focused on finding Konstantin Petrov and the other circus performers. The search proved initially fruitless. The performers had vanished completely. No one in Tralee remembered seeing them leave. No one reported hearing wagons departing in the night. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Then, on August 18th, a farmer named Seamus Murphy reported finding a body in a field 7 miles outside Tralee. The corpse belonged to one of the acrobats, a young Romanian man known only as Nikolai. He'd been dead approximately 4 days, suggesting he died around the same time as Dmitri. Cause of death, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. 2 days later, another body appeared. The second acrobat, this one a Polish woman named Katarzyna. Same manner of death. Same approximate time. The pattern became clear. Konstantin Petrov was eliminating witnesses. Inspector Weatherby requested assistance from British authorities in major port cities. If Petrov intended to flee Ireland, he would need to book passage on a ship. The The inspector distributed descriptions: tall man, heavy Russian accent, likely traveling with a strong man, a fire eater, and a fortune teller. The breakthrough came on August 24th. A telegraph arrived from Liverpool. Authorities had detained 4 individuals matching the description of circus performers attempting to board a ship to Hamburg. They were holding them pending confirmation from Ireland. Weatherby traveled immediately to Liverpool. He identified the fire eater and fortune teller definitively. But Konstantin Petrov and the strongman were not among those detained. Under interrogation, the fortune teller, a French woman named Simone Dubois, revealed everything. Her testimony, recorded in detail and later used in court, painted a picture of systematic abuse and ritualistic madness. According to Dubois, Konstantin Petrov was not Dmitri's uncle. The 2 men shared no blood relation. Petrov had purchased the young man in St. Petersburg 7 years earlier, in 1861, from Dmitri's father, a nobleman fallen on hard times who owed Petrov a substantial gambling debt. The transaction was illegal even by Russian standards, but it occurred in the chaos following the emancipation of the serfs. Many desperate men sold their children during that period. Few authorities investigated. Petrov's purpose for acquiring Dmitri related to his obsession with an ancient Slavic bear cult. According to Dubois, Petrov believed that sacrificing a pure soul to a sacred bear would grant him power and prosperity. The ritual required specific conditions. The victim must be young, must be innocent of serious sin, and must be bound to the bear by iron and willingly offered to the beast by their guardian. Dmitri's father's sale of his son constituted, in Petrov's twisted theology, a willing offering. For 7 years, Petrov had kept Dmitri in various states of captivity, moving from town to town across Europe with his circus. He subjected the young man to escalating abuse, apparently believing that suffering would purify the victim's soul. But why did he wait so long to complete the sacrifice? According to Dubois, Petrov required a specific alignment of what he called sacred signs. He consulted astrological charts and ancient texts constantly. Only on August 13, 1868, a new moon coinciding with certain planetary positions, did conditions align properly. That night, Petrov drugged the other performers with laudanum mixed into their dinner. While they slept, he forced Dmitri into Masha's cage. The young man was already weak from 3 days of forced starvation, Petrov's way of purifying him for the ritual. Petrov chained Dmitri to Masha, locked the cage, and waited. What occurred inside that cage could only be imagined, but the evidence suggested Dmitri survived for several hours. Masha, starved by Petrov's deliberate neglect, eventually attacked. The young man's screams apparently woke the other performers, but Petrov stood guard outside their wagons with a loaded pistol, threatening to kill anyone who interfered. By morning, Dmitri was dead. Petrov unlocked the cage door and left it open. Masha, still chained to the body, eventually wandered out. The bear's instinct to range, to move through territory, compelled her to drag the corpse toward the center of human activity, Market Square. Petrov's plan had been to flee before the bear appeared in town, but Masha moved faster than anticipated. When he realized what was happening, Petrov decided to eliminate witnesses. He shot Nikolai and Katarzyna, then fled with his strongman companion. The manhunt for Konstantin Petrov lasted 3 weeks. Authorities tracked him through Liverpool, then Manchester, then lost his trail near Sheffield. He seemed to have simply disappeared into England's industrial landscape. Then, on September 14th, exactly 1 month after Dmitri's death, a constable in Glasgow found a body floating in the River Clyde. The man had been dead approximately 1 week. Cause of death, drowning, though evidence suggested he'd been severely beaten before entering the water. The body's face was unrecognizable, but the clothing and physical description matched Konstantin Petrov. In the dead man's coat pocket, authorities found a leather journal, the same one Inspector Weatherby had seen in Petrov's wagon. The final entry, written in Russian and later translated, read, "The ritual failed. The bear died before consuming the sacrifice completely. The power did not transfer. Everything I worked for wasted. The cult elders will have me killed for this failure. Better to end it myself on my own terms, but first I will make them pay." The them remained unclear. Shortly after Petrov's body was identified, the strongman who had accompanied him was found dead in a Glasgow boarding house. He'd been strangled. The murder was never solved. The legal proceedings that followed set important precedents. Simone Dubois and the fire eater, Josef Mencken, were charged as accessories to murder. Their trial in Dublin became a sensation, drawing international attention. Newspapers across Europe and America reported on the bear cult murder. The defense argued that both defendants had been victims of Petrov's manipulation, held in a state of psychological captivity through fear, and witnessed horrors they were powerless to prevent. The prosecution countered that they had facilitated Dmitri's abuse through their silence and inaction. The jury reached a verdict after 4 days of deliberation, guilty of being accessories, but with a recommendation for mercy given the extreme circumstances. Dubois received 7 years imprisonment. Mencken received 5 years. Both served their full sentences. Upon release, Dubois returned to France and disappeared from public record. Mencken emigrated to America, where he worked as a laborer in Philadelphia until his death in 1891. The Tralee Town Council faced difficult questions about their own role. Why had they allowed the circus to remain for 2 weeks despite mounting evidence of abuse? Why had Constable Fitzgerald not acted more decisively when he found Dmitri with fresh bruises? The questions led to reforms. Ireland's Royal Irish Constabulary issued new guidelines requiring officers to investigate signs of abuse, regardless of social status or occupation. The Catholic Church issued pastoral letters reminding priests of their duty to report suspected crimes to authorities. But for the people of Tralee, no amount of legal reform could erase what they'd witnessed. Margaret O'Sullivan sold her market stall and moved to Cork. She never attended another market day. Patrick Brennan left his blacksmith apprenticeship and joined a monastery, seeking solace in contemplation. Father Michael Brennan requested a transfer to a different parish. His bishop granted it. The circus grounds behind St. John's Church were never used again. For years, grass grew over the wheel ruts left by Petrov's wagons. Children were forbidden from playing there. Adults walked past quickly, averting their eyes. In 1872, the town council purchased the land and had it consecrated as a additional cemetery space. Dmitri Volkov was reburied there beneath a simple stone that read, Dmitri Volkov, 1842 to 1868. May God grant him the peace he was denied in life. The bear, Masha, was buried in an unmarked grave outside town. Some residents wanted the animal burned, believing it had been corrupted by dark magic. Others argued the bear was merely an animal, innocent of the evil humans had imposed upon it. Dr. Hayes argued successfully for burial. The creature, he said, was as much a victim as the young man. The Tralee traveling circus bear case resonated far beyond County Kerry. At its core, the tragedy exposed the vulnerability of those existing on society's margins. The poor, the foreign, the dispossessed. Dmitri Volkov had been sold by his own father, transported across Europe in chains invisible to those who didn't look closely, and died screaming in a cage while neighbors slept mere yards away. How many others suffered similar fates? The question haunted Victorian reformers. In the wake of the case, investigations were launched into traveling entertainment troupes across Britain and Ireland. What authorities discovered shocked even hardened inspectors. Children kept in conditions of virtual slavery. Performers bearing scars from systematic beatings. Individuals held captive through a combination of debt bondage, threats, and psychological manipulation. The circus and traveling show industry, it turned out, provided perfect cover for predators. Parliament responded with the Traveling Shows Regulation Act of 1871, requiring all touring entertainment companies to register with local authorities and submit to periodic inspections. The law mandated minimum standards for living conditions and prohibited anyone under 16 from performing with dangerous animals. Enforcement proved inconsistent, but the legislation represented a significant shift in governmental responsibility for protecting vulnerable populations. The case also sparked intense theological debate. Konstantin Petrov's obsession with ancient pagan rituals disturbed both Catholic and Protestant clergy. How could such beliefs persist into the modern age? What did it say about Christianity's reach that a man could travel through Christian nations practicing human sacrifice? Religious scholars noted that bear cults had indeed existed in pre-Christian Slavic regions. Archaeological evidence confirmed ritual bear burials dating back thousands of years. Some Slavic communities maintained folk traditions involving bears well into the 19th century. But actual human sacrifice? Most academic experts dismissed Petrov's beliefs as the delusions of a madman, unconnected to any genuine religious tradition, ancient or modern. Others weren't so certain. A Russian Orthodox priest, Father Alexei Volkonsky, published a controversial pamphlet in 1870 arguing that fragments of pre-Christian beliefs persisted in rural Russia, sometimes emerging in grotesque forms when combined with mental illness and isolation from proper religious instruction. The psychiatric community approached the case differently. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Victorian Britain's most prominent psychiatrists, wrote extensively about what he called ritual monomania, an obsessive fixation on religious or magical practices that could drive otherwise rational individuals to horrific acts. Maudsley used Konstantin Petrov as a case study in his 1874 book, responsibility in mental disease. He argued that Petrov likely suffered from a form of paranoid delusion, possibly compounded by ergot poisoning or another organic brain disease. But Maudsley also noted something disturbing. Petrov had functioned successfully in society for years. He ran a profitable business. He negotiated contracts. He managed complex logistics. His madness, if madness it was, remained focused and purposeful. We must consider, Maudsley wrote, that the most dangerous individuals may not be those who appear obviously insane, but those whose delusions integrate seamlessly with their public persona. The case influenced literature and popular culture significantly. Bram Stoker, then working as a civil servant in Dublin, followed the trial closely. Scholars note clear parallels between Konstantin Petrov's obsessions and certain themes Stoker would later explore in Dracula. Ancient evil persisting into modernity, foreign threats infiltrating British society, the corruption of innocence. Wilkie Collins, already famous for The Woman in White and The Moonstone, wrote a short story in 1873 titled The Showman's Secret, clearly inspired by the Tralee case. In Collins' fictionalized version, the victim escapes and exposes his captor, providing the happy ending reality denied. But perhaps the most significant cultural impact came through folklore. Within a generation, the events in Tralee had entered Irish folk tradition as a cautionary tale. Parents warned children about trusting strangers, especially those with exotic animals. The story mutated and evolved. In some versions, the bear spoke with human voice. In others, Dmitri's ghost haunted the circus grounds seeking vengeance. The tale spread beyond Ireland. Variants appeared in Scotland, Wales, and northern England. By the early 20th century, folklorists documented at least 17 different versions of the circus bear's revenge across Britain. The case also revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature. Multiple witnesses had noticed signs of Dmitri's suffering, the bruises, the fear, the locked door. Yet intervention came only after spectacular violence forced their attention. Why? Historians and social psychologists have examined this aspect extensively. The phenomenon, later termed bystander effect by researchers in the 1960s, describes how individuals fail to offer help when others are present, assuming someone else will act. But in Tralee, something additional was at work. The Victorian tendency to dismiss the suffering of others, foreigners, circus performers, anyone outside respectable society. Dmitri Volkov was Russian, strange, part of a transient underclass. His pain registered differently than if he'd been a local shopkeeper's son. This selective empathy had consequences beyond individual tragedies. It allowed systemic abuses to flourish across Victorian society, in workhouses, in colonial territories, in factories and mines where the poor labored in conditions that would horrify modern observers. The Tralee case provided a mirror. When the British and Irish public looked into it, they saw their own capacity for indifference reflected back. Did it change anything? Marginally. The Travelling Shows Regulation Act helped some vulnerable performers. Press coverage of the case contributed to broader reform movements focused on protecting the powerless. But the fundamental problems, human cruelty, the dehumanization of the marginalized, the tendency to ignore suffering when it's convenient, those persisted. They persist still. In Tralee itself, the case left permanent marks. The town's population declined throughout the late 19th century as residents moved away, seeking fresh starts. Those who remained rarely spoke of what happened. It became a shared secret, acknowledged through silence. The market square was repaved in 1875, covering the bloodstains that had soaked into the old cobblestones. But older residents claimed you could still see darker patches in certain light, probably just shadows or variations in the stone, probably. St. John's Church stands today much as it did in 1868. The field behind it, where Dmitri Volkov is buried, contains neat rows of gravestones from various eras. His marker was replaced in 1968, on the centenary of his death, with a slightly larger stone funded by a local historical society. Visitors occasionally leave flowers there, small gestures for a young man who died alone, in terror, far from home. What do you think drove Konstantin Petrov to such acts? Was it genuine? In delusion, believing ancient rituals would grant him power? Or was it simply sadism dressed in religious justification, the excuse of a predator who enjoyed inflicting suffering? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you know of similar cases from history, victims hidden in plain sight, suffering ignored until tragedy forced recognition, share those stories too. Our community here at the Silent Abbey is dedicated to remembering those forgotten chapters of history, especially the victims whose names might otherwise be lost. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you won't miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of the past. These stories matter. The dead deserve to be remembered, and we, the living, must learn from their suffering. See you in the next video. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we allow to exist by looking away